Hello, and welcome to Ethics in the News. My name's Hannah Storm, and I'm the director of the Ethical Journalism Network. In this edition, I'm speaking with Isabelle Roughol. She's a journalist and writer who specialises in newsroom innovation and leadership. And I began by asking her how COVID-19 has exacerbated challenges that the news industry were already facing.
As you know, the business model has been the big issue in media for easily the past decade. There's been a significant economic crisis for a lot of media, and especially for local media. With COVID-19, you have a very sudden drop in revenue for a lot of these news outlets, mainly because advertising is drying up. Businesses are struggling in all industries, especially the kinds of businesses that would still be advertising in the local press. Your local pizza joint and restaurants and shops are obviously pulling that advertising spend because of the situation. And so you have news outlets that have very little revenue. Now, some had diversified that revenue in other ways. Events was a very popular one, and obviously events are not happening right now. Subscriptions, they're still out there. There's still people taking donations from their readers or subscriptions and memberships. Obviously, everyone is hurting financially. If you've just been furloughed or laid off, you may not want another subscription for your family. So it's just a pretty obvious imbalance of income on one hand and outgoing expenses, which are not changing all that much because they still have staff. And a very special added issue for the news business is that a lot of the help that has been imagined for small businesses by various governments, it's true in the UK, it's true in a lot of other places, is furlough schemes. Now, essentially that means you can put your business in hibernation mode, tell your employees not to work, and then the government will cover, in some cases, 80% of wages. The problem with journalists is the last thing you want to do is to furlough them because the work that they do is essential to all of us understanding what's going on with COVID, to keeping our communities together, to keeping our governments accountable, especially as they're spending a lot of money right now and taking measures that are limiting our freedom. So it's really important to have that watchdog role.
We've spoken a bit about the essential nature of journalism in terms of local and community press. Why in your mind is that so essential?
When we as journalists start defending our profession and our industry as being special and of value in all this, it can very quickly sound like we're patting our own backs or thinking that we're more special than other industries, which are definitely essential. I think the major difference is that journalism is a function that has been recognized in all of our democratic institutions and constitutions as fundamental part of democracy, as the fourth estate. And we, journalists, news media, perform that essential role, that public service within a system that is a private system, a private business, unlike in Europe and Western Europe, unlike healthcare, unlike education, which are also essential public service, but provided by a public institution. So you need to somehow figure out a private business model that works in order to deliver a essential public service. So that's really the unique challenge of journalism. And locally, especially, you have news media that are helping keep their communities together. At the Public Interest News Foundation, where I'm a trustee, we did a survey of independent news media in late March, which feels like a million years ago now, but already nearly 2/3 of our respondents, a bit over 60% of our respondents said that they are not just providing journalism in their community and news reporting, they're also organizing donations, dispatching volunteers, doing all of that essential work of like being the glue of their community. And that there's often, especially in smaller town, I live in a tiny village out here, it's often the newspaper that is fulfilling that role. That's why they're doubly important. You also have the issue of being a government watchdog, which is a very important role of journalism. Our governments are increasing public spending right now at unprecedented rates. They are making laws and taking decisions that are limiting our freedoms, our civil rights, and rightly in many cases, but it is the role of the press to be keeping an eye on that, to be letting us know what's going on. For all these reasons, we really can't afford to not have journalists working right now.
If furlough schemes aren't the answer, what is the answer in terms of supporting independent media to keep afloat?
I think there's a couple in the immediate term. First, the British government had a major public health advertising campaign recently, and the stated goals of that campaign was both to inform the public on how to go about safely during this pandemic, and the other goal was to help fund the press, which is great. The only issue with that campaign is that they did a deal with the NMA, the News Media Association, which only covers a number of large national and regional titles. So the campaign was across a lot of the press, but not all of the press. And so at the Public Interest News Foundation, we're looking after the interests in supporting independent news publishers, which are much smaller outfits. A lot of them local or hyper-local, but also investigative places like Bellingcat or niche industry publications. And all of these outlets are, especially the local ones, are very deeply embedded in their communities. Often they're the only news media serving that particular community when the larger newspaper chains have left for economic reasons. They're really inventing a new model, which I think is really interesting, for the longer term in terms of entrepreneurship in media. They're working with their community. They're involving the community in their journalism in a way that doesn't necessarily happen in more traditional newsrooms. They're inventing a lot of ways of doing journalism digitally. So I think these are really interesting organizations, and they serve in the UK 14.9 million readers, so not a small number of people. And the campaign completely glossed over them. So the first thing I would love to see happen is for public health advertising to be spread fairly across all media so that these newsrooms have access to that public spending as well. And these are newsrooms that often employ like 2-3 people. So, just a few £1,000s can cover their losses, can cover salaries for a month or two. Like, they're very small amounts that they need to make a major difference. The other way is simply direct funding to news media that cover COVID, that support our communities right now. If the money exists for a furlough scheme for people not to work, well, maybe the same amount of money exists, but to let people work. The way the furlough scheme works is wages are paid if people stop working. Well, how about we put that same amount of money, but let journalists work for that money? Longer term, certainly would be useful to have kind of all the stakeholders get together for a major rescue plan for the news business. Obviously, the issues predate COVID in a lot of ways. I don't think that now is the time to relitigate that and who did what wrong. And certainly many in the news media did a lot of things wrong, not just in the news media, to get to the situation that we're in now economically. But I think if we let the independent press die, we will all lose out in very significant ways.
These independent publishers are perhaps representing or serving communities that are potentially more vulnerable in this crisis. What would you say to underscore the fact that these independent news media organisations are really serving communities who are potentially much more vulnerable in this scenario?
We're talking really about media, in some cases, in rural communities that are quite far away from the major national media, far away from hospitals and far away from the decision makers, and it works both ways. Like it helps them be informed. It also helps the broader world be informed about what's going on in those communities and not forget that there are plenty of people in our country, and just because you don't see them when you step outside your door in Westminster, they're out there. And you also have independent media serving, sometimes in other languages, serving immigrant communities around the country. Because they're narrow in their focus, in their interest, they're very close to their communities and they're able to know what's going on. They end up serving people who will not read the national media. And so that's where they're, I think, especially connected.
We've seen some money being poured into media by social media platforms in the past few weeks and couple of months. What would your response be to that? Is that a solution?
It's one of the solutions. I saw some initiatives by Facebook and by Google that had a significant amount of money for local media. Once you divide it up by however many people need it, it's going to end up being small grants. I think it's great that that money is on the table. I don't think it absolves anyone from the business decisions that they make and how it impacts the media. I think there are a lot of people in these companies that are genuine in their interest in helping the media. I think their business model depends on it. I think they, as individual, as citizens, are interested as well. You know, I used to work in a social media company. I used to work with Silicon Valley people. I think often when we talk about these companies, we forget that there are actually people behind them who are genuinely interested. Now, whether they have the means and they're putting sufficient money behind what they're saying, that's a whole different story. So I think, I can't imagine a small media outlet struggling right now not taking that money. It's if it's on the table, that's great, but it's, again, doesn't absolve anyone, and it's not sufficient for the situation that we have right now. It helps, certainly.
What is the Public Interest News Foundation doing to try to amplify the great roles that independent news media are playing, and to try to bring people together to collectively find some kind of solution?
So we've aligned with the ICNN in this campaign, a social media campaign called Save Independent News. So it's hashtag Save Independent News, trying to highlight what independent news providers are doing and why they're important and their connection to the community, and the thing that they're asking for right now, which are that direct funding regardless of furloughs, that public health advertising spend, and the third, which seems to be okay now, which is that journalists are recognized as essential workers and have access to special treatment, quote unquote, from the UK government as essential workers, or access to testing and childcare and all these things. That one seems to be fine right now. So really we're looking for that funding, hoping to see if we can raise some of that as well to provide grants in some way. I should say that we're a very new organization and I joined the board in March, just before we all got locked down. So we just had big plans for the year that we're now having to change in pretty significant ways and get on our feet as a new organization. Like, we were born in 2020 pretty much, so it's been interesting.
There's extra pressures on small newsrooms as well, aren't there? For instance, if they have staff ill from COVID-19.
You have newsrooms that are already very, very small, either because, they're new independent publishers getting started with a small staff, or just because there have been so many layoffs in the past decade plus that you already have a skeleton staff in a lot of newsrooms. And so if on top of that you start having people sick, like a newsroom with 2 editors out on sick leave, that's a lot of people in a small newsroom. So all of a sudden, you have more and more work trying to keep your community appraised of what's going on. You have new demands in terms of innovation, like either because you're the one helping organize help in your community, or because you can no longer distribute your print products, so you're trying to invent something new digitally, or literally like print it out in your home and hand deliver it to people's front doors, and then you have half the people to do it. So it's just an incredibly challenging times, and people were already exhausted from years of working on bare bones staff and with very little money in a very challenging economic situation for media.
And that was Isabelle Roughol speaking with me for this edition of Ethics in the News.